Welcome to The Explainer. We're here to break down the big ideas. And today's idea, well, it's about as fundamental as it gets.
So let's just jump right in. When you think about what built the ancient world, what comes to mind? You probably think of great rulers, right? Brilliant generals, visionary kings. But what if I told you the real architects of civilization, the invisible hands shaping entire cultures, were just the mountains, the deserts, and the rivers they all lived on?
Because today, we're going to make the case that geography was the single most powerful force shaping those first great civilizations. I mean, it wasn't just about where people could plant their crops. No, it went so much deeper. It dictated how they thought, who they worshipped, and even the basic structure of their power.
All right, so two rivers, two worlds. To prove our point, we're going to start with a tale of two civilizations, Mesopotamia and Egypt. And what defined them? You guessed it, the very different rivers that gave them life.
And wow, the difference is just night and day. Look at this. Over in Mesopotamia, you've got the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These things were totally chaotic, violent, unpredictable floods, and to make things worse, the land was flat and wide open, leaving them completely vulnerable to invasion. But then you look at Egypt. The Nile? It was like a gift from the gods. Gentle, predictable floods every single year. Farming was a breeze, and they were surrounded by these massive protective deserts. It's like they were cocooned from the rest of the world.
And this right here, this is the domino effect in action. That one single geographical reality, it shaped everything. The Mesopotamians, living in a constant fear of floods and invaders, they developed a really pessimistic culture. Meanwhile, the Egyptians, secure, prosperous, they were naturally optimistic, and you can trace this difference through their entire societies, their view of the afterlife, how they saw their rulers, and even their basic political structure. It all comes back to the rivers. Okay, next up, gods, kings, and afterlife. Let's really dig into how these different worldviews got baked into the very fabric of these societies.
So if you lived in Sumer, the world's first civilization in Mesopotamia, life was just a constant state of anxiety. Seriously, they saw themselves as these powerless little servants at the mercy of angry, totally unpredictable gods. And to try and earn their favor, they built these massive temple towers called ziggurats. They were basically just trying to appease the gods 24/7. You can feel this gloominess perfectly in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's all about tragedy and trying to find meaning in a really, really harsh world.
But then you have the complete flip side in Egypt. The Egyptians were so confident in the stability of their world that their whole focus was on the afterlife. They believed it would be this perfect continuation of life on Earth. So naturally, they poured unbelievable amounts of resources into building tombs, like the Great Pyramid of Khufu. The whole point was to make sure their pharaoh, who they saw as a living god, a tradition going way back to the first unifier, Narmer, had a safe journey to that perfect afterlife. If he made it, Egypt's own eternity was guaranteed. And get this, it even shows up in their writing. In Mesopotamia, you have cuneiform. It was scratched into wet clay tablets. It's a super practical tool, for administration, tracking taxes, logging trade deals. But in Egypt, hieroglyphs were this beautiful, sacred script used almost entirely for religious stuff. For literally centuries, nobody could read them. Their meaning was totally lost. That is, until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which was the key that finally unlocked all their secrets.
Okay, so we're moving beyond the river valleys now, because this whole pattern, it wasn't just happening in the Middle East. We see the same kind of thing playing out all across the ancient world.
Let's take the Indus Valley civilization in what's now Pakistan. They also had a predictable river and the life-giving monsoon rains, and their cities, places like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, were just incredible. So well planned, so organized, you just know there had to be a strong central government. But here's the mystery. We can't read their language. It's part of the Dravidian family, which is still spoken in southern India, but we just can't crack the code. And then, to top it all off, their entire civilization just disappears. Poof, gone. It's one of history's biggest whodunits.
Okay, so we've seen how rivers can create these huge, settled civilizations. But what about places where you can't farm? What happens when there are no big rivers to build your society around? Well, on the enormous grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, geography created a totally different answer: pastoral nomadism. These were entire societies built on the move, herding animals across vast territories.
And think about what that kind of life does to a culture, this constant movement, this toughness. It basically forged cultures that were made for war. You've got groups like the fierce Scythians and other Indo-European peoples like the Hittites. They became absolute masters of the horse and the war chariot, and that made them this constant disruptive threat to all those settled complex societies we were just talking about.
So what happens when one of these nomadic groups moves in for good? Well, when the group known as the Aryans migrated into India, they didn't just conquer the place, they fundamentally remade the entire society. They brought with them their sacred texts, the Vedas, and imposed this incredibly rigid social hierarchy, the caste system. It divided everyone into these distinct classes, or varna, from the Brahmins, the priests, at the very top, all the way down to the Dalits, or untouchables, at the very bottom. This wasn't just about your job. It was a spiritual structure of jati justified by ideas like karma and reincarnation, locking people into their place for life.
Now, over in the Levant, the Hebrew people had a totally different geographical problem. You could call it the curse of the crossroads. They were stuck right between the two great superpowers, Egypt and Mesopotamia. They were never isolated, and they were almost never safe. I mean, their entire history, from Abraham migrating out of Mesopotamia, to Moses leading the Exodus from Egypt, to kings like Saul, David, and Solomon trying to carve out a kingdom in Jerusalem, it's a story of survival. The kingdom of Israel gets destroyed by Assyria, later Judah is conquered and they face exile in Babylon. It was this constant pressure that forged their unique identity and their belief in one single all-powerful God, Yahweh.
All right, now we enter the Age of Empires. For centuries, you have all these different worlds, the river valleys, the steppes, the crossroads, all kind of developing on their own tracks, but that couldn't last forever. Eventually, ambition, new technology, and just sheer force of will, it made them all collide.
And suddenly, empires are popping up everywhere. Back in Mesopotamia, you get the world's very first empire builder, Sargon of Akkad. He's followed by Hammurabi of the Babylonian Empire, famous for his single law code. Then Egypt gets a shock when invaders with chariots, the Hyksos, actually conquer them for a while. But Egypt strikes back, creating its own new kingdom empire under warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III. But honestly, all of that was just the opening act for the real game changer, the massive Persian Empire. Guys like Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great didn't just conquer a piece of the pie, they took the whole thing, uniting the entire region into one state.
And this sets the stage for one of the most famous showdowns in all of history, the Persian Wars. This wasn't just a war, it was a clash of civilizations, two completely different ways of life. You have the Persian Empire, this huge, centralized superpower. And on the other side, a collection of tiny, independent Greek city-states, the polis. Places like democratic Athens and the hardcore military state of Sparta. This was a fight for the future, and it all went down at legendary battles like Marathon and Thermopylae. The fate of the Western world, no joke, hung in the balance.
And just when you think you know how the story goes, one man comes along and just shatters the whole game board. He rebuilds the world in his own image. His name? Alexander the Great, from a little kingdom called Macedon. And yeah, he happened to be tutored by some guy named Aristotle.
I mean, think about this. In just over a decade, Alexander's conquests create a brand new, interconnected world. He completely topples the Persian Empire and marches his armies all the way to the borders of India. And he doesn't just conquer, he builds. He founds new cities, like the famous Alexandria in Egypt, and deliberately mashes Greek culture, its politics like democracy and oligarchy, its philosophy, with the ancient civilizations of the East. After he dies, way too young, his massive empire gets split up among his generals, creating new dynasties like the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Persia. This kicks off what we call the Hellenistic world, a totally new age, where Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian ideas all start to mix.
And that brings us to our final section, a connected ancient world. The big takeaway here is that this new era wasn't about geographic isolation anymore. It was all about the connections being forged through war and trade. The old maps, the old boundaries, they were basically gone.
And you can really see that flow here. Ideas started traveling just like cargo. You had precious materials like lapis lazuli moving from east to west, but you also had new ways of thinking, Greek philosophy, Indian Buddhism, flowing in every direction. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in India, who is actually inspired by Alexander's invasion, converts to Buddhism and starts sending missionaries west. Over in Alexandria, scholars translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Everything was connected.
So what does this all mean? If geography was destiny for the ancient world, you have to wonder, how much of our world is still shaped by maps we can't even see? It seems like geography sets the stage, right? It creates the optimistic farmers in one valley and the anxious warriors in another.
But in the end, it's what people do on that stage, the empires they build, the ideas they trade, the connections they make, that actually writes the script of history. It's a story that started with a couple of rivers, but it's a story we are all still living in today.